The crisp autumn air held a faint hint of ripe grapes as the vineyards of Chateau du Bois stretched out in orderly rows under the golden sun. The estate, famed for its exquisite wines and the family's long lineage of vintners, was hosting the annual Vintners' Gala, a tradition dating back to the reign of Louis XIV. The manor house, with its ivy-clad walls and stained glass windows depicting Bacchus himself, stood proudly at the center, bustling with elegantly dressed guests. Inside, laughter mingled with the clinking of glasses. The patriarch of the Dubois family, Etienne Dubois, was holding court among a circle of fellow wine connoisseurs, his booming voice recounting tales of vintages past. His daughter, Camille, stood by his side, her graceful poise a stark contrast to Etienne's bluster. To one side, sommelier Jacques Rousseau busied himself arranging the bottles for the upcoming tasting. Not far from the gathering, in the grand drawing room, the mood was considerably darker. A man lay sprawled on the floor, his eyes wide open, frozen in terror. The silver handle of a great knife protruded from his chest, the blade buried deep. The victim was Jean-Luc Menard, a competitor in the wine industry, and a man with whom Etienne had recently had a heated argument. The scream that followed the discovery sent a shiver through the entire gathering. Guests hurried to the drawing room, whispering frantically. Etienne pushed through the crowd, his face ashen as he saw Menard's body. Camille clasped her hands to her mouth, and Jacques, pale and trembling, dropped the wineglass he had been holding. Amid the rising chaos, a tall, impeccably dressed figure stepped forward. Hercule Poirot, his mustache meticulously groomed and his eyes keenly observing every detail, gently patted the arm of a sobbing maid. "Calmly, mademoiselle. Tell me precisely what you saw." Between sobs, the maid managed to stammer, I came to set out the linens for the evening, and he was just there, dead." Poirot nodded thoughtfully, his gaze sweeping the room. He noted the half-open French windows leading to the garden, the overturned wineglass on the side table, and a smear of red on the rug. Not wine, but blood. The local gendarme arrived shortly, and Inspector Luc Bisset approached Poirot, removing his cap in deference. "Monsieur Poirot, what a grim business. I heard you were attending the gala. Your assistance would be invaluable." Poirot gave a modest nod. But of course, one must never overlook the importance of timing, my friend. Now let us proceed with order and method. Who last saw Monsieur Menard alive?" Etienne cleared his throat. He was in here, arguing with me. Just an hour ago. We were discussing the auction prices. He accused me of undercutting him, but I swear, Inspector, I did not kill him. Poirot fixed Etienne with a curious glance. "And after your argument, monsieur?" Etienne wiped his brow. "I left to greet some guests. Jacques, Camille, and I were in the hall." "Anyone will tell you so." Jacques nodded. "Yes, we were arranging the wines for the tasting. I never saw him come out." Poirot made a mental note of their statements. He could feel the tension among the guests, a tight web of suspicion and unease. Camille stepped forward, her voice steady despite her pale complexion. Papa may have argued with Menard, but he would never do such a thing. Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Mademoiselle, was there anyone else who had reason to quarrel with Monsieur Menard?" Camille hesitated. Menard was a ruthless businessman. He had many rivals. He accused my father of undercutting him, but there were rumors he had stolen some of our blending secrets. Some believed he was trying to ruin the family business. Poirot inclined his head. "Intriguing. Inspector Bisset, we must speak with those who were nearby at the time of death. Let us proceed with method, yes?" As the guests dispersed to the great hall, Poirot lingered a moment, eyes narrowing at the blood smear on the rug. He bent down, delicately tracing a gloved finger over it. A faint smile played on his lips. "Ah, mon ami," he whispered to himself. "Already there is a contradiction. The truth is never so obvious." Etienne's haggard face remained fixed on the lifeless body of Jean-Luc Ménard, his eyes filled with a blend of shock and fear. Camille clutched his arm tightly, her knuckles white, but her face remained a stoic mask, betraying only the slightest tremor in her lower lip. Around them, whispers rippled through the crowd as guests speculated in hushed tones, their gazes flicking nervously toward the French windows that led to the moonlit garden. Poirot straightened, his keen eyes noting the positions of the onlookers, the way some leaned in eagerly to catch every whispered word, while others shrank back, instinctively distancing themselves from the scene. He had long since learned that in such moments the guilty often revealed themselves not through their words, but through their silent reactions. Inspector Bisset, his stout frame framed in the doorway, took a deep breath before addressing the room. No one is to leave the premises until we have taken statements. Clear the room. Return to the main hall. Mademoiselle Camille, Monsieur Etienne, Monsieur Jacques, you will remain here for questioning. The crowd dispersed reluctantly, the murmurs fading as the doors swung shut. Poirot noted the lingering glances, the furtive whispers exchanged behind cupped hands. He allowed himself a brief smile, knowing that the atmosphere of shared suspicion would be his greatest ally in uncovering the truth. As Bisset stepped closer, adjusting the wide leather belt at his waist, Poirot gently touched his arm. "A moment, my friend," he whispered. "Before the room is disturbed, let us examine it more closely. The smallest details can tell us much." Bisset gave a sharp nod, his dark eyes settling on the corpse. "You have a theory already, Poirot." Poirot waved a gloved hand dismissively. "Ah, not a theory, mon ami. Merely observations. The wineglass on the side table, overturned, yet only a small amount of liquid spilled. A strange thing, no? And the blood smear on the carpet, not directly beneath the body, but to the side, as if the poor man staggered before falling." Bisset frowned, leaning closer. "You mean he wasn't killed instantly?" "Precisely," Poirot replied, his tone light, but his eyes sharp. "He had time to move, perhaps even to struggle. Yet there are no signs of a struggle on the nearby furniture. No disturbed cushions, no shattered glass. Only that small smear of blood. Curious, no?" Poirot turned his attention to the French windows. Their brass handles gleamed in the dim light, but as he leaned in to inspect them, his brows knitted together. He reached out and carefully pressed the latch, hearing the faintest squeak as the mechanism slid back. "Interesting. They've been oiled recently, but not thoroughly. The left handle is smoother. The right one sticks slightly." He straightened and turned back to the others. "Tell me, Monsieur Dubois, when did you last use these windows?" Etienne's head jerked up, his pale eyes clouded with confusion. I do not use them often. They lead to the gardens, yes. But the main entrance is more convenient for greeting guests." "Yet someone used them tonight," Poirot said softly. "Someone who perhaps intended to enter or exit without being seen." He crossed the room, his footsteps muffled by the thick Aubusson carpet, and bent to examine the threshold. His eyes sparkled as he gently brushed a gloved finger against a faint smudge on the stone floor. A footprint, partially obscured but still visible. Someone left in haste, it seemed. Bisset leaned in beside him, peering at the faint mark. "A man's shoe, from the size, yet none of the guests entered that way, to my knowledge." Poirot smiled, rising smoothly to his feet. "Ah, but who said it was a guest, my friend?" He turned to Etienne. "Monsieur, you said you were with your daughter and Monsieur Rousseau at the time of the argument. Can anyone else confirm this?" Etienne swallowed hard, his gaze flicking nervously to his daughter. Camille met his eyes briefly before speaking. "Yes, Papa and I were with Jacques, arranging the wine selection for the tasting. There were several guests nearby. Monsieur Legrand, Madame Beauchamp, they can vouch for us." Jacques nodded eagerly, a slight quaver in his voice. "Oui, yes, we were together." We did not leave the hall. Poirot's sharp gaze lingered on Jacques a moment longer than necessary, noting the beads of sweat forming along the young man's hairline. He filed this detail away, his mind already weaving the threads of a complex tapestry. "Very well," Poirot said, stepping back to allow Bisset to take the lead. "Inspector, I leave the formalities of securing the scene to you. I shall speak with the maid who discovered the body." Her shock seemed genuine, but one can never be certain in such matters. Bisset nodded, moving to confer with his officers as they began cordoning off the room. Poirot made his way to the hallway, where the young maid sat trembling on a velvet settee, her tear-streaked face pale against the dark wood paneling. "Mademoiselle," Poirot said gently, sitting beside her, "you must tell me exactly what you saw. Do not fear. I'm here to find the truth." The maid looked up, her eyes wide. I came to set out the linens, as I said. When I entered, I saw him lying there, the knife in his chest. I screamed and ran for help." Poirot leaned in, his expression intent. "Did you touch anything? Move anything?" She shook her head violently. "No, monsieur. I was too frightened." Poirot allowed a small, reassuring smile. "And did you hear anything before you entered the room? A voice, perhaps? Footsteps?" The maid hesitated, her brow furrowing. "Now that you mention it, I thought I heard the French windows close, but I was not sure. It was so faint, like a whisper." Poirot's eyes glittered with interest. "Merci, mademoiselle. You have been most helpful." As he stood, Poirot's mind raced through the implications. Someone had indeed used the garden entrance, a person either bold enough to risk discovery or desperate enough to escape unseen. Either way, it was a critical piece of the puzzle. He glanced back at the drawing room, where Menard's body remained as silent testimony to a deadly encounter. Somewhere amid the clinking glasses and whispered gossip, the killer still lurked, watching, waiting, perhaps already weaving their next lie. Poirot adjusted his cuffs and straightened his tie. The game had begun. As the maid retreated, still visibly shaken, Poirot rose and made his way back into the main hall. The guests had gathered once more, their anxious murmurs filling the air like the low hum of bees disturbed from their hive. Glasses clinked nervously, and the rich aroma of aged wine mingled with the sharp, metallic scent of fear. Poirot moved through the room with the quiet assurance of a man who knew the weight of every step, every glance. Etienne Dubois stood by the grand fireplace, one hand resting on the marble mantel, his eyes distant as he stared into the crackling flames. His daughter, Camille, had taken a seat on a nearby chaise, her posture rigid, her gaze fixed on the embroidered hem of her gown. Jacques Rousseau lingered near the wine table, his fingers trembling as he polished an already gleaming decanter. Poirot approached the young sommelier, his expression one of mild curiosity. "Monsieur Rousseau," he began, his voice low but penetrating. "You were with Monsieur Dubois and Mademoiselle Camille at the time of the argument, yes? You say you never left the hall." Jacques flinched, his fingers slipping from the polished glass. He looked up quickly, his eyes darting to Camille before returning to Poirot. "Yes, Monsieur Poirot. We were discussing the order of the tasting, selecting the vintages to present to the guests. I never left their side." Poirot tilted his head, his eyes narrowing. "Yet your hands tremble, and your brow is damp. Is it the shock of the murder, or something else that unsettles you, I wonder?" Jacques forced a thin, brittle smile. "It is the shock, monsieur. The shock of seeing a man I knew dead." "Of course," Poirot replied smoothly, his tone betraying no judgment. He let the silence stretch between them, watching as Jacques fidgeted, his eyes flicking nervously toward the grand staircase. Poirot noted this with interest before turning away, his gaze sweeping the room once more. Etienne, sensing Poirot's approach, straightened and attempted a weak smile. "Monsieur Poirot, You must believe me. I had no reason to harm Menard. Yes, we argued, but it was merely business, nothing more. Poirot clasped his hands behind his back, his expression unreadable. Business, yes. But business is often a matter of pride as well as profit, is it not? And pride, monsieur, can lead a man to desperate actions. Etienne's face flushed with sudden anger. I am a Dubois. My family has been making wine for generations. I would never lower myself to violence over a mere business rivalry. Poirot inclined his head, his gaze sharp. And yet, Menard accused you of undercutting him, a claim that, if proven true, could ruin your family's reputation. Perhaps he sought to expose you, to destroy your legacy. Etienne opened his mouth to respond, but Camille spoke first, her voice brittle yet defiant. Menard was a bully and a scoundrel. He spread lies to undermine our family. My father may have been angry, but he is no murderer. Poirot turned to her, his eyes thoughtful. And you, mademoiselle, you defend your father with such passion. Did you perhaps overhear more of this argument than you admit? Camille's eyes hardened. I heard enough to know my father is innocent, and if you seek to cast suspicion on him, you waste your time. Poirot's lips twitched in what might have been a smile, had the circumstances been less dire. I admire your loyalty, mademoiselle, but I must follow the truth wherever it leads. With a slight bow, Poirot moved away, his keen mind already sorting through the tangled threads of motive and opportunity. He glanced toward the French windows, now guarded by a young gendarme. He had no doubt the footprint he had discovered would prove significant, but for now, his attention shifted to the other guests, those who had hovered at the edges of the conversation, their expressions a mix of fear, curiosity, and, in a few cases, the careful blankness of the deeply concerned. He approached a small group near. The marble staircase, Monsieur Legrand, the stout, balding banker, and Madame Beauchamp, a sharp-eyed woman with an aristocratic bearing and an air of barely concealed disdain for the gathered crowd. They fell silent as Poirot approached, their eyes widening slightly. Ah, Monsieur Legrand, Madame Beauchamp, Poirot said, his voice smooth as a fine Bordeaux. You were both present in the hall earlier, were you not? Legrand nodded quickly, his jowls quivering. Yes, monsieur. I was just coming in from the terrace when I heard the commotion. Madame Beauchamp's lips tightened into a thin line. Indeed, Monsieur Poirot, though I must say, this whole affair is most uncivilized. Blood and violence have no place in polite society. Poirot smiled politely, noting the slight curl of her lip as she spoke. Indeed, madame. But tell me, did either of you see anyone moving about the drawing room before the body was discovered? Legrand's face grew even paler, if such a thing were possible. No, I did not. I heard raised voices, Dubois and Menard, I believe, but I thought little of it. Men of business often quarrel after all. Madame Beauchamp's eyes narrowed. I saw nothing myself, but I heard a door close. I assumed it was a servant, but now... She trailed off, her eyes flicking toward the drawing room. Poirot inclined his head. Merci, madame, monsieur. You have been most helpful. As he turned away, his mind raced through the possibilities. A door closing, a footprint in the garden, a glass overturned but barely spilled. He paused at the foot of the grand staircase, his fingers absently adjusting his cuffs. Somewhere within this grand chateau, a killer moved among them, their heart perhaps pounding as they watched him work. Poirot took a deep breath, his little gray cells already leaping ahead, piecing together the fragments of a puzzle that only he could solve. The shadows lengthened in the great hall, stretching across the polished marble floors like the creeping tendrils of the vines outside. Somewhere in those shadows lay the truth, and Poirot intended to uncover it. Poirot moved slowly through the great hall, his mind assembling the scattered pieces of the puzzle, even as he observed the subtle interactions among the guests. He noted how Jacques Rousseau now kept his distance from Camille, casting anxious glances in her direction but avoiding direct eye contact. Etienne, meanwhile, had settled into a brooding silence by the fireplace, his shoulders hunched and his gaze unfocused, as if the crackling flames held the answers to his troubles. A discreet cough at Poirot's elbow drew his attention. It was Inspector Bisset, his expression grim. "Poirot, I have had the body removed to the study for examination. The knife, a grape knife, as you likely noticed, was driven deep with force and precision. No sign of hesitation." Poirot gave a slight nod. "Bien sûr, a deliberate act. A crime of passion or premeditation, I wonder. Tell me, mon ami, have your men found anything else of interest?" Bisset lowered his voice. "The windows in the drawing room, the ones you examined. My men found fresh scuff marks on the stone just outside, the kind left by heavy boots, and a faint trace of mud, though the garden paths are mostly gravel." Poirot's eyes brightened at this, his mind immediately spinning through the implications. "Mud, you say? Then our intruder likely came from the vineyards, where the soil is rich and damp. Interesting. Very interesting." He glanced back toward the main hall, where the guests now milled about in uneasy clusters, their conversations reduced to anxious whispers. The atmosphere had shifted, the clinking of glasses and polite laughter replaced by the heavy, watchful silence of those who knew themselves to be suspects. Poirot's gaze fell once more upon Jacques, who had edged closer to the grand staircase, his movements tense and furtive. The young sommelier seemed a man poised on the edge of flight, his thin fingers clutching at his wine-stained apron as if for reassurance. Poirot moved toward him, his step unhurried but purposeful, drawing the young man's attention like a horse circling a nervous mouse. "Ah, Monsieur Rousseau," Poirot said, his tone light but his eyes sharp. "I wonder if I might have a word." Jacques started, nearly dropping the glass he had just picked up. His eyes flicked around the room as if seeking an escape route before settling uneasily on Poirot's composed face. "Of course, Monsieur Poirot," he replied, forcing a tight smile. Poirot gestured toward a small side alcove, its velvet curtains offering a semblance of privacy. Jacques followed reluctantly, his shoulders hunched as if bracing for a blow. When they were alone, Poirot leaned in slightly, lowering his voice to a confidential murmur. "Tell me, Monsieur Rousseau, how well did you know the late Monsieur Menard?" Jacques blinked rapidly, his pale face flushing slightly. I knew him only in passing, monsieur. We moved in the same circles, of course. One cannot work in the wine business without crossing paths with such men. But I would not say we were close." Poirot tilted his head, his eyes never leaving the young man's face. "And yet you seemed particularly unsettled when I questioned you earlier. Was it merely the shock of death, or is there something more you wish to confess?" Jacques' fingers tightened around the glass, his knuckles whitening. He hesitated, his gaze darting once more to the drawing-room door, where a gendarme now stood watchful and unmoving. Poirot allowed the silence to stretch, watching the way Jacques' Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed nervously. Finally, the young man exhaled, his shoulders sagging as if releasing a great weight. "It is true," he whispered, his eyes darting to the door again. "I did have a disagreement with Menard. He accused me of sabotaging one of his shipments last month, claimed I had deliberately misdirected a delivery, costing him a lucrative contract. It was a lie, of course, but he threatened to ruin me, to destroy my reputation." Poirot's expression remained impassive, though his mind raced ahead, considering the implications. "And did you confront him about this accusation?" Jacques hesitated, then gave a small, defeated nod. "Yes, earlier this evening. I confronted him in the corridor outside the drawing room. I demanded he retract his accusation. He merely laughed, said I was a fool to think I could challenge a man of his influence." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And what did you do then, Monsieur Rousseau?" Jacques' eyes filled with a desperate light, his breath coming in shallow, panicked gulps. I left him there, laughing at me. I went to find a drink to calm my nerves. I never saw him again until they found his body." Poirot reached out, his gloved hand resting lightly on the young man's shoulder. "Courage, my friend. I do not accuse you, but I must know all that transpired if I am to find the true culprit." Jacques' head jerked up, his eyes wide. "You believe me, then? That I am innocent?" Poirot allowed himself a small, enigmatic smile. "I believe you may be a poor liar, Monsieur Rousseau, but that alone does not make you a murderer." Jacques exhaled, his body sagging against the wall, his relief palpable. Poirot stepped back, adjusting his cuffs as he considered his next move. The young sommelier's story had opened a new avenue of inquiry, one that pointed not just to personal animosity, but to a deeper, more insidious rivalry. A rivalry that could well have provided the perfect motive for murder. As he returned to the main hall, his mind ticking through the growing list of suspects and motives, Poirot's gaze settled once more on Camille, still seated on the chaise. Her expression remained distant, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Poirot paused, his eyes narrowing as a new thought struck him. The young woman had defended her father with passionate conviction, yet she had remained curiously silent when Jacques had spoken of Menard's threats. Poirot's eyes gleamed with a sudden, almost predatory light. The threads of the case were beginning to pull tight, and he felt the faint but unmistakable thrill of an approaching revelation. He straightened his tie, his mind already moving to the next step, the next question, the next subtle turn of the psychological screw. The truth, he knew, was always in the small things. The slight tremor of a hand, the hurried glance toward a door, the half-heard whisper of a closing window. And Poirot, above all others, had learned to listen. Poirot lingered for a moment, watching Jacques as the young sommelier stumbled away, his movements erratic and his eyes downcast. He had the look of a man burdened by secrets, but not necessarily by the weight of murder. Poirot made a mental note to consider the possibility that Jacques' fear sprang from something other than guilt, perhaps a smaller sin that had become entangled in the greater web of deceit surrounding Menard's death. Turning, Poirot allowed his gaze to sweep once more across the assembled guests. Camille had risen from her seat, her slender form framed against the flickering firelight. She whispered urgently with her father, her hands gesturing in small, agitated motions. Etienne's face, already pale, seemed to drain of the last vestiges of color as his daughter's words reached his ears. Poirot's sharp eyes missed nothing. The tightening of Etienne's jaw, the slight tremor in Camille's shoulders, the way the elder Dubois placed a protective hand on his daughter's arm, as if shielding her from a sudden chill. Poirot approached quietly, his footsteps muffled by the thick Aubusson carpet. He paused just within earshot, pretending to adjust the cuffs of his impeccable shirt. Camille's voice, though low, reached his ears, each word sharp with suppressed emotion. "We cannot let him know, Papa. If he finds out—" "Hush, ma fille," Etienne whispered back, his tone urgent. "Now is not the time." Camille's jaw tightened and she pulled away, her gaze flashing with a mix of fear and defiance. But if he suspects, if he already knows— Poirot chose this moment to step forward, his expression politely curious. "Pardon, Monsieur Dubois, Mademoiselle Camille. I hope I am not interrupting." Camille stiffened, her eyes widening in alarm before she quickly lowered her gaze, her lashes casting delicate shadows against her flushed cheeks. Etienne, by contrast, forced a thin smile, his grip on his daughter's arm tightening momentarily before he released her. "Not at all, Monsieur Poirot," Etienne said, his tone overly bright. "Merely a father comforting his daughter in a moment of distress. These events have shaken us all." Poirot inclined his head, his eyes never leaving Camille's face. Of course, such a tragedy would weigh heavily on any family. "Mademoiselle, I hope you will forgive my intrusion, but I must ask, did you have any personal dealings with Monsieur Menard? It is clear that your father and he were business rivals. But you, perhaps, had a different relationship with the deceased? Camille's head jerked up, her eyes locking with Poirot's for a fraction of a second before she looked away, her hands clasping tightly together. I knew him, of course. Everyone in the wine trade does. But we were not close, if that is what you mean. Poirot's gaze remained steady, his mind absorbing every flicker of her expression, every slight tremor in her voice. Indeed. And yet you defended your father with such conviction earlier. You spoke of Menard as a bully, a man who sought to undermine your family. That suggests a more personal animosity. Camille's lips tightened, her eyes flashing with sudden defiance. Menard was a threat to my family's reputation. He spread lies, sought to ruin us. I hated him for it, yes, but that does not mean I would kill him. Etienne stepped forward, his voice sharp. Monsieur Poirot, my daughter is not on trial here. If you have questions, direct them to me. Poirot held up a placating hand. Of course, monsieur. But you must understand, I seek only the truth. The truth often hides in the smallest details, in the whispers of family secrets. Etienne's face darkened, his nostrils flaring with suppressed rage, but he forced a tight, brittle smile. Then I suggest you look elsewhere for your secrets, monsieur. My daughter has nothing to hide. Poirot inclined his head, allowing a small, almost imperceptible smile to touch his lips. As you say, Monsieur Dubois, I shall trouble you no further. For the moment. He turned away, his mind already leaping ahead to the next thread of inquiry. As he moved toward the grand staircase, his gaze swept the room once more, catching the furtive glances, the whispered conversations, the nervous shifting of feet. He paused near the open French windows, their brass handles glinting softly in the firelight, and took a deep breath of the cool night air. A sudden sound, faint but distinct, reached his ears, a whisper of movement from the garden beyond. Poirot's eyes narrowed, his mind immediately parsing the possibilities. A fleeing suspect? An eavesdropper, perhaps? He hesitated only a moment before stepping onto the stone terrace, his polished shoes making no sound as he moved into the shadows. The gardens stretched out before him, their neatly trimmed hedges and carefully tended flower beds bathed in pale moonlight. A faint rustle drew his attention to the left, where a narrow path wound through the rose bushes toward the vineyards beyond. Poirot's sharp eyes caught a brief flicker of movement, a figure slipping silently among the vines, the hem of a dark cloak trailing over the damp soil. Poirot allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. The hunter had become the hunted. He stepped off the terrace, his stride purposeful but unhurried as he followed the faint, muddy trail into the darkness. His mind raced through the possibilities. Who among the guests had reason to flee? Who had something to hide, something that could not bear the scrutiny of his little gray cells? As he rounded a corner, the vineyard rose, stretching out like the ribs of a great stone cathedral. He caught sight of the figure again, a slender form, moving swiftly but cautiously, pausing now and then to glance over their shoulder. Poirot quickened his pace, his shoes crunching softly on the gravel path as he closed the distance. The figure reached the far edge of the vineyard and hesitated, their head turning as if sensing pursuit. Poirot ducked behind a thick cluster of vines, his breath coming in steady, measured intervals as he watched the figure, glance back once more before slipping through a gap in the stone wall that marked the boundary of the Dubois estate. Poirot straightened, his mind already calculating the angles, the routes of escape, the possible destinations beyond the wall. He allowed himself a brief, triumphant smile. The game, it seemed, was afoot. Poirot hesitated at the edge of the vineyard, the cool night air wrapping around him as he considered his next move. The figure had slipped through the gap in the stone wall, vanishing into the darkness beyond. He could hear the faint rustle of dry leaves, the whisper of footsteps retreating into the night. Yet Poirot did not rush forward. He paused, his head tilting slightly as he reached up to adjust his bow tie with deliberate precision. It was not in his nature to chase like a hound upon the scent. No, Poirot preferred to let his prey believe themselves safe, to lull them into a false sense of security before tightening the snare. He stepped back into the shadow of a nearby cypress, his eyes narrowing as he considered the freshly disturbed soil at his feet. The small clumps of mud, the faint, hastily made boot prints. They told a story, if one knew how to listen. He bent down, his gloved fingers gently prodding the damp earth. The impression of the sole was deep, the edges sharp. Someone had moved swiftly, without care for the noise they made. Poirot straightened, brushing a fleck of dirt from his sleeve. This was no practiced criminal, but someone driven by fear, or perhaps desperation. With a final glance at the darkened gap in the wall, Poirot turned back toward the chateau, his stride unhurried. He had learned much from this brief pursuit, more perhaps than the fleeing figure intended. He knew now that there were secrets among the guests that reached beyond the simple animosity of business rivals. Secrets worth risking exposure, perhaps even worth killing for. As he approached the terrace, the light from the grand hall spilled out in golden, trembling pools, casting elongated shadows across the polished stones. The guests had begun to gather once more, drawn together by the magnetic pull of shared anxiety. Poirot noted the way they whispered in tight clusters, their eyes darting nervously toward the French windows as if expecting a sudden apparition. Camille Dubois stood near the marble staircase, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face pale but composed. Her father, Etienne, had resumed his position by the fireplace, though his earlier defiance had given way to a deep, brooding silence. Jacques Rousseau hovered near the wine table, his hands wrapped around an empty glass, as if seeking the comfort of its familiar weight. Poirot entered the room quietly, his sharp eyes missing nothing, the quick, darting glances, the way conversations hushed at his approach. He crossed to the sideboard, selecting a glass of the Dubois family's prized claret. He swirled the dark liquid slowly, watching the way the firelight caught in the ruby depths before taking a measured sip. As he placed the glass back on the polished wood, a familiar voice cut through the low murmur of the crowd. "Monsieur Poirot," came the smooth, cultured tones of Madame Beauchamp, her dark eyes gleaming with a predatory light as she stepped forward. "You seem deep in thought. Have you found the threads of this terrible affair, or do the vines still twist too tightly for even your sharp mind to unravel?" Poirot turned, his expression one of polite surprise. "Ah, Madame Beauchamp, you are as perceptive as ever. Yes, I find myself deep in thought, for there are many threads to this particular tapestry, and each seems to lead to another knot." She arched a slender brow, her lips curling into a faint, amused smile. "And do you believe the murderer is among us, monsieur? One of us here, sipping wine and whispering in corners, even as the body of poor Menard grows cold in the study." Poirot met her gaze, his own eyes sharp and unblinking. "I've learned, madame, that in cases such as this, the guilty often reveal themselves through their attempts to conceal. A nervous glance, a too quick denial, a door left ajar. The small things, they matter." Madame Beauchamp's smile faltered slightly, her fingers tightening on the delicate stem of her glass. She recovered quickly, her eyes narrowing as if weighing his words for hidden barbs. "And what of you, monsieur? Do you not conceal much behind that implacable expression? Are you too playing a game with us?" Poirot allowed himself a small, enigmatic smile. "Perhaps, madame, but my game is one of truth, while others play for survival." She hesitated, her dark eyes flicking momentarily toward the staircase before she inclined her head, her expression once more the picture of aristocratic poise. "Then I wish you luck, Monsieur Poirot. May the truth serve you well." With that, she drifted away, her dark gown trailing behind her like the shadow of a departing storm. Poirot watched her go, his mind already sifting through the implications of their brief exchange. Madame Beauchamp had revealed little with her words, but much with her manner. She, too, had secrets, and perhaps more at stake in this affair than she wished to admit. Poirot set his glass down, his eyes sweeping the room once more. He caught a flicker of movement near the far wall, where a heavy velvet curtain swayed gently, as if recently disturbed. He crossed the room with measured steps, his hand reaching out to pull the curtain aside. Behind it, he found a small side door, its polished brass handle still warm to the touch. Poirot's eyes narrowed, his mind leaping ahead to the vineyard, the fleeing figure, the hidden paths that wound through the darkened estate. He straightened, his eyes gleaming with sudden clarity. The game, it seemed, had entered a new phase, and the stakes were rising with every whispered word, every half-glimpsed shadow. Poirot stepped back, his expression one of quiet satisfaction as he adjusted his cuffs and smoothed his neatly parted hair. He had begun to see the shape of the truth, the faint outlines of the killer's plan, and he intended to pull each thread tight until the entire tapestry unraveled before him. Poirot lingered by the side door, his gloved fingers tracing the cool brass handle as his mind pieced together the fragments of the evening's events. The warm metal beneath his touch confirmed what he had already suspected. Someone had slipped through this door recently, likely the same figure he had glimpsed in the vineyard. But who? And why take such a circuitous route, fleeing through the darkness when the house offered warmth and safety? He straightened, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the crowded hall once more. The guests had begun to drift apart, their initial clusters breaking into smaller, more cautious gatherings as the reality of the situation settled over them. Trust, already a fragile thing among business rivals, had dissolved entirely. Poirot's gaze found Camille once more, her slender form leaning against the balustrade at the foot of the grand staircase. She had taken on the air of a tragic heroine, her eyes distant, her mouth set in a tight, unreadable line. Her father stood nearby, his broad shoulders hunched as he stared into the dying fire, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. The tension between father and daughter had not escaped Poirot's notice. Their whispered exchange earlier had hinted at secrets, fears carefully hidden beneath the veneer of respectability. Poirot's sharp eyes had caught the brief clenching of Etienne's fist, the way Camille had pulled back as if suddenly aware of a danger too close for comfort. As if sensing his scrutiny, Camille's head turned sharply, her eyes locking with Poirot's for a brief electric moment. She straightened, her hands slipping into the folds of her evening gown as if to conceal a sudden tremor. Poirot inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the silent challenge, before moving away with a small, enigmatic smile. His path took him toward the wine table, where Jacques Rousseau still lingered, his glass now refilled, the deep red liquid trembling slightly in his unsteady grasp. The young sommelier's eyes flicked up as Poirot approached, his face pale and drawn, his earlier bravado evaporated. "Ah, Monsieur Rousseau," Poirot said smoothly, reaching for a nearby bottle of claret. "I see you have chosen to fortify yourself. The nerves, they are a tricky thing, are they not?" Jacques managed a thin, uncertain smile. "Oui, Monsieur Poirot. These are trying times." Poirot poured himself a small measure, lifting the glass to his nose and inhaling the rich, earthy aroma with evident appreciation. "Ah, the terroir of the Dubois estate. Remarkable, is it not? The soil, the climate, the careful hand of the vintner, all must be perfectly aligned to create such a wine." Jacques' hand tightened on his glass, his jaw clenching slightly. "Indeed, monsieur, it is a delicate balance, easily upset." Poirot's eyes gleamed as he took a slow sip, his gaze never leaving the young man's face. Just as in life, n'est-ce pas? One small mistake, one misstep, and the entire vintage is spoiled. Jacques' eyes darkened, his throat working as he swallowed hard. "You speak in riddles, monsieur." Poirot set his glass down, leaning in slightly, his voice dropping to a confidential murmur. "Perhaps. But then, life itself is a riddle, non? full of small contradictions, hidden truths, and overlooked details. Before Jacques could respond, a sudden clatter echoed from the far end of the hall. The sound of shattering glass, followed by a sharp, stifled cry. Heads turned, conversations ceased, and a ripple of tension passed through the room like the first chill of an approaching storm. Poirot straightened, his eyes snapping toward the source of the disturbance. Near the entrance to the dining room, Madame Beauchamp stood frozen, her dark eyes wide with a mix of shock and fury. At her feet lay the shattered remains of a crystal wine glass, the deep red liquid pooling around her feet like freshly spilled blood. Etienne Dubois had risen from his seat by the fire, his eyes narrowing as he crossed the room in quick, purposeful strides. "Madame Beauchamp, are you injured?" Madame Beauchamp's lips parted, her breath coming in short, frantic gasps as she clutched at her throat, her gloved hand trembling violently. No, I thought I saw..." Her words trailed off, her eyes darting toward the darkened hallway leading to the study. Poirot's sharp mind immediately grasped the implications. Madame Beauchamp, normally so composed, had glimpsed something that had shattered her carefully maintained poise. Poirot stepped forward, his small form weaving through the gathering crowd as he approached the stricken woman. "Madame," he said gently, his eyes searching her face for the telltale signs of fear, of guilt, of recognition. "You seem distressed. What is it you saw?" She shook her head violently, her dark hair swaying like the wings of a startled raven. "Nothing, monsieur. Nothing of importance." Poirot's eyes flicked to the darkened hallway, his mind spinning through the possibilities. Had someone moved through the shadows, emerging briefly into the light before slipping away once more? A ghostly echo of the past, or a more tangible flesh and blood intruder? Before he could press her further, a voice broke the uneasy silence. It was Camille, her tone sharp and accusing as she stepped forward, her eyes fixed on Madame Beauchamp with a sudden, startling intensity. "You saw something, Madame. Do not deny it. You have been watching us all evening, your eyes never still, always calculating. What did you see?" The room fell silent, all eyes turning to the two women, their figures starkly contrasted in the flickering firelight. Camille, pale and tense, her fists clenched at her sides, and Madame Beauchamp, her dark eyes wide and uncertain, her chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. Poirot felt a thrill of anticipation, the faint but unmistakable sensation of the truth beginning to pull itself free from the shadows. He stepped back slightly, allowing the confrontation to play out, his mind already considering the implications. The threads of the case were tightening, the small details aligning, and Poirot, ever the master of human nature, had begun to glimpse the shape of the final reveal. The time for subtle hints and whispered accusations was drawing to a close. Soon, the truth would stand revealed, its sharp edges cutting through the carefully woven fabric of lies and half-truths. The room fell into a strained silence, the tension crackling like a live wire. Camille's outburst had shattered the fragile calm that had settled over the assembled guests, each word a dagger aimed directly at Madame Beauchamp. For a long moment, the older woman remained frozen, her dark eyes locked with Camille's, the shattered glass still glistening at her feet like the remnants of a broken promise. Poirot's sharp eyes darted between the two women, his mind racing to connect the fragments of their shared history, the unspoken animosities and carefully concealed fears that bound them together. He had sensed the undercurrents of distrust from the moment he entered the chateau, but now the currents had begun to surge, threatening to pull the entire household into the abyss. Madame Beauchamp straightened slowly, her gloved hand falling to her side as she drew herself up to her full height, her eyes narrowing into slits of polished obsidian. "I do not take kindly to accusations, Mademoiselle Dubois," she said, her voice low and cold, each word precisely measured. "Be careful, my dear. You tread on dangerous ground." Camille's chin rose defiantly, her pale face flushed with a sudden, reckless courage. "And yet you do not deny it." You saw something. You know something. The assembled guests, sensing the gravity of the moment, fell silent, their eyes flicking nervously between the two women. Etienne Dubois stepped forward, his broad shoulders tense, his thick brows drawn together in a deep, stormy scowl. "Camille," he said sharply, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Enough. This is not the time for childish provocations." But Camille did not back down. She stepped closer to Madame Beauchamp, her voice rising, her slender hands clenching and unclenching at her sides. "You act the part of the concerned guest, the grieving friend, but I have seen the way you watch us, the way your eyes linger on my father when you think no one is looking. You have always envied us, always sought to undermine our family. Now, with Menard dead, you see an opportunity to strike." Madame Beauchamp's eyes flashed dangerously, her lips curling into a thin, contemptuous smile. "You speak like a child, Camille. You know nothing of the true nature of this affair. You cling to your father's side like a frightened doe, but even you must see the truth. Your family is crumbling, your empire built on a foundation of lies and half-truths." Etienne took another step forward, his face flushed with a deep, angry red. "I will not allow this. You come into my home, you drink my wine, and you dare to insult my daughter." Poirot, sensing the confrontation spiraling toward open conflict, raised his hand gently, his voice cutting through the rising din with a calm, measured tone. "Please, mes amis, let us not allow our passions to overwhelm our reason. We are all under great strain, and the night is yet young. Let us instead seek the truth with cool heads and clear minds." He turned his gaze to Madame Beauchamp, his eyes sharp and unblinking. "Madame, if you have seen something, if there is a truth you fear to speak, now is the time to do so. I can assure you the truth will come out, one way or another." For a long, breathless moment, Madame Beauchamp hesitated, her dark eyes flicking nervously around the room, her gloved hands twisting together in a rare display of uncertainty. Finally, she drew a deep breath, her shoulders straightening as she met Poirot's steady gaze. "I did see something," she said slowly, each word falling like a stone into a still pond, sending ripples of shock through the assembled guests. "But it is not what you think. It was not a ghost, nor a shadow, nor some trick of the firelight. It was a person, a man, moving through the hall just moments before the glass shattered." A collective gasp rippled through the room, heads turning sharply, eyes darting to the darkened hallway where the shadows seemed to stretch and breathe with newfound menace. Poirot's eyes narrowed, his mind leaping ahead, already forming a dozen possible scenarios, each one more dangerous than the last. "And this man, Madame," Poirot said, his voice a smooth, unhurried murmur. "Did you recognize him?" Madame Beauchamp hesitated, her lips parting as if to speak, before closing again with a faint, almost imperceptible tremor. She glanced at Etienne, her eyes lingering for a fraction of a second on his broad, muscular form before shifting back to Poirot. I'm not certain," she said at last, her voice low and unsteady. The light was poor, and he moved quickly, but there was something familiar about him, something I cannot quite place. Poirot's eyes gleamed with sudden, fierce interest. He had caught the subtle flicker of recognition in her gaze, the tiny, involuntary flick of her eyes toward Etienne Dubois, a gesture as revealing as a shouted confession. "Merci, madame," he said softly, inclining his head with a small, gracious smile. "You have been most helpful." Madame Beauchamp's eyes widened, her face draining of color as she realized, too late, the trap into which she had stumbled. Poirot turned away, his mind racing, his little gray cells crackling with newfound energy as he considered the implications of her words, the small but critical slip that had just revealed more than she intended. He stepped back, his sharp eyes sweeping the room, noting the tense, fearful glances, the tight, nervous whispers that passed like a contagion through the assembled guests. The threads of the case had begun to weave themselves into a clearer pattern, the faint outlines of the truth taking shape amid the chaos and confusion. Poirot allowed himself a small, satisfied smile as he straightened his cuffs and smoothed his neatly parted hair. The time for shadows and whispered accusations was coming to an end. Soon, the truth would stand revealed, stark and undeniable, and the final threads of the mystery would be pulled tight, leaving nowhere for the guilty to hide. Poirot did not speak again that evening. He excused himself with quiet politeness, claiming the need for solitude, though everyone present understood that his silence was not emptiness, but preparation. Like a violinist tuning just before the crescendo. The others dispersed with stiff good nights, their expressions wary, their glances uneasy. Camille lingered near the hearth, her eyes flickering toward the hallway as though afraid of what might still be watching. Etienne remained close to her, though his arm around her shoulders was more for himself than for her, and Madame Beauchamp retired to her room without a backward glance, her composure now brittle, held together by a will that looked close to shattering. Upstairs in his room, Poirot opened his notebook, the one bound in Moroccan leather with his initials discreetly embossed on the cover. He turned to a fresh page and began to write. Short bursts of analysis, arrows drawn between names, words underlined in firm, neat strokes. Jealousy, financial leverage, witness. Then, after a pause, he wrote, "The glass shattered after Menard died. A distraction or a witness silenced too late." He tapped the nib of his pen against the page, eyes narrowing. There had been a pattern, a subtle one, yes, but it had begun to emerge. The emotions in that drawing room had not just been grief and fear. There had been resentment, envy, and above all, calculation. Poirot had seen it many times before, the way people assumed the murder was the beginning of a story, when often it was the end of another long, hidden one. At precisely 7:30 the next morning, Poirot descended the staircase. He was freshly shaved, impeccably dressed in a dove-gray suit with a silk cravat, and his black patent shoes glimmered in the dim hall like polished obsidian. He found Jacques Bellamy in the breakfast room, nursing a half-finished croissant and poking absently at his coffee. The Vintner looked up and tried for a smile, but Poirot noted the tremble in his fingers, the half-second delay in his reaction. "You slept badly, monsieur?" Poirot asked lightly. Bellamy sighed. "I did not sleep at all, Monsieur Poirot. I have been replaying the events in my mind again and again. Menard, he was not just a partner, he was my friend." Poirot sat opposite him. "It is in the silence of the night that the conscience speaks the loudest, is it not? Tell